let's talk about China's shadow banking system, where a lot of the banks are basically pawn shops lending on overvalued and bad real estate collateral. So there is approximately $35 trillion worth of cash in China's banking system. And to get a return on that cash, a lot of that cash, whether it is on the balance sheet of a bank, it is being leveraged up with fractional reserve lending, it is in an asset management system, it is from a billionaire, or it is stolen funds from a low-level, mid-level, or high-level corrupt politician or bureaucrat in the Chinese Communist Party. A lot of that cash has ended up in China's shadow banking system looking for much larger returns than a normal bank account or savings account. So China's shadow banking system, I learned a lot about it a couple years ago. The majority of the stuff I've learned is from interviewing experts, money managers, China experts, hedge fund analysts like Emma Mollman, who I've interviewed in the past. Also the author of this outstanding book, Denny McMahon. If you're not familiar with him, he wrote this book a couple years ago. I interviewed him back in mid-2019 when the Chinese banks first started failing, like Baoshan Bank and Bank of Jinzhou and some of the other small and medium-sized Chinese banks. So we had an in-depth conversation back then. It's in the archives of my YouTube channel, but I highly recommend if you want to learn more about the credit boom, the real estate fraud, the stolen funds. What is China's shadow banking system? What are local government financing vehicles? And how trillions of dollars of bad loans were created with basically fake corporations that these local governments in China set up to monetize a lot of their land, rezoning it, and then using that as collateral to borrow from for construction loans and construction companies, or the extensive research that the author Denny McMahon put in, interviewing Chinese business owners in other fields that pledged their businesses, that pledged their factories for loans to go and buy real estate, to go and buy construction companies and start construction companies and build, that had no real estate experience. So these were very successful Chinese business people. It was talked about in the book. He interviewed them extensively. If you're not familiar with Denny's background, he lived in mainland China for over a decade. He speaks fluent Mandarin. He did extensive research on this book about local government financing vehicles and also shadow banking. If you don't want to buy the book, the audiobook I think is about 7 hours, give or take, 7 or 8 hours long. But we talk about that summarized in the interview back in 2019 for about an hour. And these affluent Chinese business people, their businesses stopped making money years ago, 2013, 2014, 2015. So these affluent Chinese business people would either go to a regular Chinese bank or they would go and pledge as collateral their factory or their business and borrow from the shadow banking system. And they would go and get loans and gamble on real estate or gamble on construction, start a construction company. So there was a ton of this in China, real estate speculation, affluent business people that were in other fields. There's articles throughout the South China Morning Post, Bloomberg, elsewhere, of affluent Chinese business people over the last 6 or 7 years going bankrupt because they pledged as collateral their businesses, their other real estate holdings, their factories, their stock holdings, etc., their other assets, borrowed more, leveraged that up, and then speculated on real estate, either commercial or residential, started a construction company that they had no experience in, and there was problems with real estate prices in tier 2 or tier 3 cities in China, with ghost cities, and corruption is just absolutely pervasive. A lot of China's economy and their GDP, not only is it based on infrastructure, it's also based on construction and real estate. So there's been an insane amount of waste, fraud, corruption, and abuse of partially finished or unfinished houses all throughout China. So Evergrande is just a microcosm of this, and Evergrande was definitely playing in the shadow banking system too. So in Denny's book, China's Great Wall of Debt, about shadow banking, ghost cities, massive loans, and all the Chinese credit bubble, Denny has just extensive stories where he talked to business people who had no real estate experience, had no construction company experience with real estate, and they went into the construction boom because their other businesses over the last 5 to 7 years, especially when Trump put tariffs on a lot of Chinese goods, that made things even worse. They went into real estate and construction too and started speculating on real estate. So a lot of the Chinese economy and a lot of Chinese investments, the foundation, which in my opinion is a house of cards, is based off artificially high real estate prices and a continuous construction boom in real estate. But is this sustainable though? As an Austrian school economist, I would argue that this is misallocation of capital on the many trillions of dollars scale. And Denny and I discussed this, and I've discussed this as well, interviewing other China experts over the last 5 to 7 years in the archives of my YouTube channel. So Evergrande definitely played in China's shadow banking system because they were gambling with employees' funds in wealth management products. And that is a common theme as well in the shadow banking system, is these wealth management products. But a lot of these wealth management products are also tied to real estate. Finally, if you like content like this and want to help keep content like this free so it doesn't all end up behind a paywall, or you want far more in-depth content research, financial education, and analysis than I provide in these short little free videos, there are now over 180 articles, charts, and audio podcasts behind the paywall, including 29 new articles out in the last 14 or so weeks, all for the cost of a Starbucks cup of coffee, only $5 a month. I think it is one of the best deals out there. I charge less than anyone else in my space for premium content. If you don't like it, you can always cancel, although I think you're going to really like it because there is a lot of interesting articles about global macro companies and sectors, including in the last couple weeks, articles about uranium companies, gold and silver miners, and other interesting topics. So if I could wrap up this short little video very quickly, a lot of Chinese banks are actually similar to pawn shops. They have taken in enormous amounts of collateral. A lot of it is bad collateral. They're based on unprofitable factories. They're based on extremely high real estate valuations. And then a lot of that borrowed funds, which was either pulled from shadow banking, pulled from people's savings. People were looking for a much higher return than normal checking accounts or savings accounts. And that's where the shadow banking comes in, and all these dangerous and sophisticated wealth management products, a lot of them are tied to real estate, but there's also bad loans out there with bad collateral, all tied to real estate. So real estate is supposedly the foundation for all of these loans in the Chinese banking system, or the majority of them. HSBC has an enormous amount of exposure to Asia's economy, especially Chinese construction companies. But this is all a house of cards. This assumes that the Chinese government will not allow any property prices to fall. So we'll see what happens with the bailouts. There's going to be some type of bailouts for Chinese banks. I do not think that the Chinese government is going to allow a lot of banks to fail. The construction companies and real estate are a totally different matter. The banking system is state-backed for the most part, especially the largest banks like China Construction Bank and some of the others.